Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and you're welcome to. Hello, everyone. My name is Ene, and you're welcome to Tribaja's negotiation event with 81 cents. I'm the community manager of Tribaja, and we're excited to partner with 81 cents on this amazing salary negotiation event. Um, Thank you for taking out time to be a part of this. We promise to make it exciting and a lot of gems will be dropped. You can react to any gem that resonates with you, and you can also drop questions in the comments and in the chat so we can attend to them. And let me tell you a little about Tribaja. Uh, Tribaja is a talent marketplace that connects um, tech talents from underrepresented groups to inclusive programs and workplaces in tech and startup. You can learn more about us by visiting tribaha.co. As a job seeker, you can create a talent profile on tribaha.co. Um, as an employer, you can also sign up on tribaha.co to get connected to diverse tech talents. And you can also partner with us in terms of events too, just like this. Um, and we have a Slack channel too. You can also join in. We have resources we share in the Slack channel. We have a job hiring channel where we post jobs too. So you can also join in our on our Slack. Join us on Slack to get to check out all those jobs if you're a job seeker. We also have a job board on tripaha.co. So you get to get access to our job board after creating your talent profile to access the job board to apply for any role that suits you. Um, so we want to call on Annie Murray. She's the lead negotiator at 81 cents, and she's here to tell us more about salary negotiations and how to negotiate our next offer. So I'm turning it over to Annie Murray. You're welcome.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. It truly is such an honor to get to speak for with Tribaja today. We here at 81 Cents, a subsidiary of Rora, are very much behind the mission that Tribaja stands for, and I'm so excited to get to speak with you all today about any potential negotiations that you may have. Now, just for your context, I'm just on one screen right now, so I'm looking at my presentation. So if you have questions in the presentation, no worries, just leave them in the chat. And once I go through them, maybe we can do a Q&A at the end. But today, I just want to welcome everyone in and tell you a little bit more about myself. So my name is Annie Murray. I am a lead negotiator at Rora, and I've been negotiating for about 2 years. During that time, I've helped make people millions of dollars back in their pockets, negotiated thousands of offers from small tech startups all the way up to the big FANG companies. And before that, I was a recruiter with Microsoft and with Amazon. At Microsoft, I was focusing on looking for folks who were going to be part of the prestigious Explore internship. And at Amazon, I focused on hiring for the loss prevention positions at fulfillment centers. And I know what you're thinking. In this economy today, is negotiation even possible? And I want to challenge that claim with yes. Now more than ever is the time that you should be negotiating. Not only, you want to make sure that you're setting your career up for success, but you want to secure the income that will keep you and your family afloat during this time. And also, it's really important to set clear and firm boundaries, especially about things that matter to you, whether that's work-life balance, whether that's the projects that you want to work on or the level that you come in at. So you definitely still can hold power here. And I know, you look at the news and it all looks bad, right? What you're hearing is true, unfortunately, that Google, Meta, Twitter, Nvidia, Amazon, Apple, all these major tech companies are on a hiring freeze. But I can also tell you that I've seen folks still get offers from these companies, and as recent as last week, get increases in the offers from these companies. So, it's not as much of a, the tap's not all the way on, but it is dripping. We are seeing offers come through. So, not only that, we've also seen many other tech companies in this space, small, medium, large, still hiring, still negotiating. So definitely don't write yourself off yet. It is still very possible. But ultimately, why does negotiation even matter? And why does it matter to you individually, right? And I think, breaking it down a little bit, ultimately, if you're just thinking about dollars on the page, if you don't negotiate, you're losing money, right? Because when you accept the first offer, that's what all future promotions and raises are based upon, right? So if everybody at your company is getting a similar raise percentage, right, every year, that if you start at a compensation that's lower than your colleagues, you'll never match what they're making, even if you get promos and raises, right? And eventually you'll end up having to leave the company and go to an external company to get paid more, right? So you don't get the career growth that you would want out of that opportunity. And it also can really help give you some insight into the values of the company. Is this even a place that makes sense for you to work at? Is this a place that's valuing you at all? Are they willing to negotiate at all? Are they completely unwilling to negotiate? And, in some instances, it can really kind of tip your hand as to which company is maybe the best fit. For example, I worked with a client who had two opportunities, one at Stripe and one at Plaid. And the Stripe opportunity was definitely her top choice to begin with. But, as we tried to go through the negotiations with Stripe, they really weren't moving on numbers. However, Plaid, without us even prompting them, went back voluntarily and increased the offer by 100K, right? So Plaid definitely was giving more value to this candidate, and they realized it, and they ended up going to Plaid, right? So at the end of the day, she realized that Stripe was not the best fit, and she could only do that by negotiating. But it does feel, right? In terms of information, if we think of information as the currency of negotiation, you're already at a disadvantage, right? Because even if you have really great friends and colleagues in the industry, along with that and maybe some online data points that you might find, that's pretty much what you have going. While the company, they've got compensation analysts that are looking at the most recent market data, looking at the stock prices as they rise and fall. They know what everybody else in the company makes. Recruiters who are trained to negotiate. I remember when I was at Microsoft, I walked past a group of what they call closer recruiters in the university recruiting department. These are folks who solely do negotiations with new grads. And I remember overhearing the person training them saying, these candidates will decline the first offer. Be prepared for them to reject the first offer. Here's how you respond to that, right? So they're getting top tier negotiation training. The hiring committee knows what the company, everybody at the company is making. It's made up of all these different people within the company, all different job titles. They're kind of the ones deciding, are you even a good fit here? And then the hiring manager, of course, also has ideas about their budget and what realistically they can afford. So all of those resources against you and your friends and online data points, it can definitely seem intimidating. But that's why companies like Rora, 81 Cents, we exist, right? We're here to help. But, if you're doing this by yourself, even if you're doing it with us, highly recommend do your research as much as you can. There's different resources, obviously. Places like H-1B salary database is a great place to look just for base salaries, while levels.fyi is good if you're looking at like a software engineer position at like Meta or maybe Apple, someplace that's very commonplace, while Team Blind is the best objectively to find solid offer breakdowns and more authentic negotiation anecdotes, right? So if you want to find more specific details on, does this company negotiate? I would recommend searching on Team Blind. And then if you're looking at a potential promotion or raise at your current workplace, I know it's awkward, but I would highly encourage you to talk to your colleagues about what they make. Now, your bosses are going to tell you, please don't do that, but it's actually in your best interest to discuss compensation with your colleagues, because otherwise you'll never know how much differential there is and where you're actually falling on the salary band. And I know, a lot of these recruiters, they're going to be selling you on lines of, don't worry, we'll take care of you later on. We'll promote you in a year. We'll give you bonuses. Don't worry about it. So the reason that we want to push for compensation now is kind of like what I was saying earlier, just in terms of any promotion or raise or bonus that you get is just based off what your original offer is that you sign, right? So if you don't push on compensation at all, you're just going off of that baseline for any promotion, right? And just to give you more of a concrete example, we worked with someone who was a DeepMind researcher. She elected to not negotiate her offer. And because of that, she got an equity package that was $340,000 over 4 years. Now, then this researcher realized, oh, some of my colleagues are making $1 million over 4 years in equity. So that's a delta of about $660,000, right? Just in the 4-year value of the offer. And this is not a slacker researcher. She was going out there and doing top tier work. Her first authored paper got an oral spotlight at NIPS. That doesn't happen to everyone, right? And the manager wanted to accommodate that, wanted to acknowledge her hard work. So they gave her a 20% raise on that base salary. But even with that, and with potential equity refreshers in the future at 75K a year, there was no way that she was ever going to be made even with her colleagues. So ultimately, she ended up leaving DeepMind, and DeepMind lost because they lost a great researcher, and she lost because she lost a potential for really strong compensation and a strong career path there. So ultimately, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? And when we're talking about value, value is such a conceptual thing, right? The value that you create for a company, it's never really going to be close to the value you extract in form of compensation, right? Because your impact is just going to keep growing exponentially over time while your comp only grows linearly, right? And that's why, for the most part, the common thought was, if I want to get an increase in comp, I should leave my company, not I should ask for a raise or promotion, right? But, these are all kind of reasons why you should negotiate. And of course, a lot of my job is also risk mitigation for folks. And my guidance to folks when not to negotiate is pretty limited. And I would say the main scenarios that would be relevant would be like, if you're talking to your hiring manager and they don't seem that enthusiastic about you joining, they don't really want to have anything to do with the negotiations. They maybe are talking about having another candidate waiting in the wings. That's indicative that the social capital you have within the company is limited, and that they're probably not going to pay out as much as you're hoping for. And if you're in a situation also where you don't have access to a hiring manager, you can only negotiate with HR, and the HR person is pushing you really hard that everything has to be equivalent in terms of compensation, that can really make it tough, because typically a hiring manager will advocate for you on the inside with these higher level managers, right? We'll go to the VPs and say, this is why so-and-so needs an increase in compensation. So when you don't have that point of contact, and when HR is focusing on, team equity, then it does make it really harder to negotiate. And I think a very common reason people decide they don't want to negotiate is fear of looking greedy. And I really want to challenge that fear today, because ultimately, negotiation is something that you have to be good at to be a good business person, right? It's a standard part of any business relationship. It's the rule, not the exception. And, it's definitely new and uncomfortable for every new hire coming in, but managers and recruiters expect this, right? Remember what the Microsoft team said. They said they will decline that first offer. They're expecting you to negotiate. And, I have a colleague, she's actually a recruiter, and she tells me that every time, a female or, minority candidate comes through and says, just accepts the first offer willingly, she in her head is saying, no, please push back, please push back. But not everybody feels inclined to, right? Some people get too nervous. But I want to encourage you to really push to advocate for your value, because at the end of the day, the recruiter and the hiring manager might even see it as a red flag if you don't try to negotiate. And, just because it's awkward and maybe has a little risk, don't let that stop you from negotiating, right? Nothing in this life is worth having without a little risk, right? When you propose to someone, that's a risk, right? When you tell someone your true feelings, that's a risk. But typically it pays off in a way, especially in negotiation, either in a way that's going to be financially advantageous for you or career advantageous for you. So, we've talked a lot about kind of the financial motivations for negotiation, but there's a whole other aspect to it of setting yourself up for success long-term in your career. And also, this kind of section will also walk you through how to set yourself up for success in the negotiation to begin with. So, be on the lookout. These companies will ask you about your desired compensation in the job application, in the first round technical screen. They want your guard to be down, so that way they, expect that you'll just call out a low number to them. And then from there, you'll just kind of end up getting committed to that number, even though it's not really an accurate reflection of your market value. And I think to set yourself up for success, not only in your career, but also in the negotiation, really do your research. Try to understand, what's the actual work-life balance at this company? What's the, actual culture within this company about paid time off? Is this an unlimited paid time off company? Or is this a company that says they have unlimited paid time off, but only really allow you to do 2 weeks before you get in trouble, right? And doing this research online is really going to help you get that context, understanding when promotion cycles are, et cetera. And ideally, you also, if you're really passionate about the company that you're looking at, you want to look at some other opportunities that are going to be a similar pay range to what you're looking at for ideal leverage purposes. So, definitely try to look for opportunities. If it's a FANG company, look at another FANG. But right now, just be mindful of the companies that are on hiring freeze. If you try to use those as leverage, your recruiters are going to ask you questions like, "Oh, how did you get through the hiring freeze?" And if you don't have a strong answer for that, it's not going to be good. But again, you want like a manga or FANG company versus manga or FANG, because the comp structure tends to be similar. Same with a startup. If you're looking at a startup compensation, typically it's going to be lower, and a lot of it based in stock options, which we'll get to a little bit later. But basically, in that scenario, if you try to bring a Meta offer to a startup, the startup is going to say, "Well, we're not Meta. We're trying to change the world. And if you want money, go to Meta." And if you try to bring a startup offer to Meta, they're going to say, "Well, this is not liquid equity, so this is essentially valueless. So we've already beaten it," right? So ideally, if you can get it to be a one-to-one company type, it's just going to be easier to get increases in leverage from there. And same with quantitative finance. Quantitative finance, they do only cash. So again, if you try to bring a Meta offer to a quantitative finance company, the quantitative finance company is going to tell you, "Oh, well, we're already better because we're giving you all cash instead of equity," right? So just try to find those equivalent companies. And I know also it sounds like, do I need to have multiple offers in hand to be successful in my negotiation? No, you can negotiate with just one offer, maybe even two. Ultimately, if you have less leverage, it means just more creative portrayal of said leverage, essentially where you're, presenting your opportunities in a very specific lens, which we'll get to a little bit later on. And again, information is the currency here in the negotiation. So we really need to be mindful about how much we're sharing and in what way are we sharing it, right? So you think about it, your recruiters are going to try to extract info from you before giving you an offer. Again, trying to ask you for your comp expectations when you're sort of, not expecting it. And the goal on our end is to have the company share the first offer, and a lot of the way that you can push back on that is just by, feigning ignorance. "I'm not sure what my market value is. Could you give me a first offer? That would really help me get a better sense of it." And at the end of the day, if you don't feel like negotiating makes sense because it feels like it's gambling, that's because these companies are the house. They are playing to win here. And, if what I can do is just help you, find that strategy to potentially get a chance to win, that's my goal. So I know I've been throwing around a lot of jargon about refreshers, about stock options, about equity grants. Let's pause for a second and just walk and talk through what those things mean, right? Because purposefully, equity is kind of designed to be complicated for the employee. So in some cases, they're maybe less inclined to negotiate it. So if you're looking at a public company, this is often given in their equity. They'll give you a lump sum equity grant, typically like a dollar amount of like $500,000 to vest over 4 years. And they might tell you how many RSUs that's associated with. Or, in some instances, they'll just give you a lump sum of RSUs. And in that case, you want to make sure you know what the stock price is that they're using to value that. Especially Amazon, Amazon will typically give you an RSU grant. So just double check what stock price was used, when was that stock price set, etc. And, also this equity, it vests over 4 years. And by vest, I mean basically it's paid out to you in increments over 4 years. Now those increments vary, and the number of years vary too, depending on the company. Coinbase, their equity vests over 1 year, while at some companies it vests over 5 or 3, and the percentages can be different. At Amazon, they backload their equity vesting schedule, so you only get 5% in year 1, but in years 3 and 4, you get 40%, right? And a lot of this stuff, it does differ from company to company, so just don't hesitate to ask. It's really your recruiter's job to try to explain this to you as best they can. Another point of verbiage that they might throw around is a cliff, an equity cliff, and basically that means that you would have to stay at the company for a specific length of time before you get the first payout. So essentially, sometimes it's like, oh, your cliff is 1 year, so the year after you started the company, then you get your first amount of equity granted to you. And that's, kind of the easier one. Private equity is a little bit more complicated. Recruiters use this to their advantage, because it's more challenging to value. Because essentially, private equity, it's kind of the Schrodinger's cat of equity, in that it both has value and has no value at the same time. So the best thing that you can do is really try to get data points to help you understand what the actual value would be today. Because your recruiter is going to tell you, oh, this is worth $1 billion. This has the potential to do XYZ, right? And you have to take that with a grain of salt. So the best way that you can understand what the value is today is to understand what's the preferred price of the options, what's the strike price of the options, and how many options are on the table right now. So the preferred price, that's essentially that's the price that investors pay to exercise or buy back their options once the company IPOs. It's typically a high amount because investors have a bit more risk that they have to mitigate. While the strike price is the price that you as the employee would pay to exercise these options. Typically it's low. They don't want you to have to shell out a lot for it. So usually it's about 10 or 50 cents. And then the calculation that you want to do is subtract that strike price from the preferred price, then multiply it by the number of options that they're offering you. And that's going to give you a more accurate valuation of what your equity is worth today, right? But still, just take it with a grain of salt. It's a good way to sort of make you and your recruiter on the same page about what's the actual equity value. And another thing to be mindful of is that the preferred price and the strike price, those are set based on events, right? The preferred price is set at every 409A valuation for the company, right? And it's important to look on websites like Crunchbase. This is a great resource if you're looking at startups. You can type any startup name in the search bar and you can find, okay, here's the company, here's when their most recent funding round was, here's their most recent, valuation amount, and that you can actually see, okay, it looks like the preferred price, the last 409A valuation, which happens at every funding round, looks like the last funding round was December of 2021. So maybe that preferred price isn't as accurate anymore. And then it's important, to double check with your recruiter, okay, what would be an appropriate multiplier to put on this preferred price at this point? While the strike price, that's mostly set based upon the fair market value for the options at the date of the offer. So that one typically is more recently set than the preferred price, but good to double check. And I know that this is a lot when it comes to private equity, and I've only scratched the surface. So I'd highly encourage you, check out our blog at teamrora.com. We have some more context there. There's also some great blogs on Carta, C-A-R-T-A. They have some really good equity information, especially about how equity is taxed, which is like a whole other thing. Now we've talked about startups and we've talked about, big tech companies, but there is kind of a Venn diagram here of the big tech late stage startups, right? You've got TikTok, Snowflake, Airtable. These are all companies that are doing very, very well. And because of this, and because how late stage they are, they're offering actual RSUs, even though they're still private. And, this basically means that you are getting that sort of cash amount for your equity early. It's mostly just based upon the fact that they're so large, it's easier for them to get a solid idea of what their shares are worth. Now, of course, if you join TikTok and you're hoping for a strong upside at IPO, you're probably not going to get it because they're offering RSUs, right? So less upside, but more stability in your comp from day one. So kind of more of a personal preference there. And I know I threw around the term equity refreshers. So basically what these are, this is a performance-based equity grant. It vests separately from your original grant that you got when you started, but it's typically over the same time frame. So, if the equity grant is over 4 years, so will a refresher grant, right? And basically, you would do your first performance evaluation, maybe, at the beginning of year 2, you get a grade based on that. And depending on your grade, you get a percentage of your equity grant with maybe a multiplier on that. But let's just say you met expectations. Typically, it would be about 25% of your original equity grant would be what would be granted to you, just, baseline refresher. And from there, if you get, let's say your original equity grant was 100K and you get a 25K refresher year 2, year 3, if you also get a 25K refresher, year 4, you get one, year 5, you get one. Eventually you've accrued enough to make up for that 100K that you originally got. So that way, once that fully vests, you're still basically getting the same compensation that you were before, just with refreshers instead of your original equity grant. Now, I know that for a lot of these companies, there's not a ton of data online, and it can be challenging in those scenarios to really navigate this, especially again with the information disparity. But it's not impossible, right? And unfortunately, it's pretty common. If you're not looking at an Apple or Meta software engineer, it's going to be a bit more of an uphill battle to get accurate compensation data or negotiation anecdotes. I would say when you're looking at your sources, Glassdoor is great if you want reviews of what it's like to work at the company. Not so great in terms of compensation. They don't typically have full offer breakdowns on there. Levels.fyi is good because it shows you when the date was that they've posted these data points, so you can kind of know how stale it is. But also just be aware that if you're looking at a company like Amazon, remember I said they have that weird equity vesting schedule. That's not really accounted for in Levels, data point structure. So just keep that in mind. And then Team Blind is probably the best website to use if you're just looking for breakdowns at companies where the equity doesn't vest evenly, or maybe it's a more niche job title. But ultimately, even with all of that, it still might not be possible for you to find data points. And in that instance, the best thing that you can do, push the company to share the first offer and add a reasonable percentage onto that as your counter offer. And by reasonable percentage, really depends on the company and the leverage. If it's on the smaller side with limited leverage, I'd say like 20% onto the yearly compensation. But if it's larger and you feel really confident that your hiring manager likes you and wants to bring you on board, maybe ask for a 30% increase on the yearly comp. But ultimately, if you have a very firm number in mind, my recommendation would be to ask for a number that's slightly above what you want and expect the company to not match this number, but come under. So for example, if you're aiming for 500K yearly comp, ask for 525 because they're never going to match. They're always going to come lower, right? And then regarding in terms of company culture and stuff like that, because that's also something that you're looking for in your research, best course of action in that scenario, sit down with the hiring manager, ask them those hard-hitting questions, those things that matter to you. Realistically, how many hours am I going to be working a week? What projects can I expect to take on within my first 6 months? What's the promotion cycle look like? Things like that. Because if you're not finding that information online, you have a right to ask them about it. Because again, at the end of the day, not only are you selling yourself as an engineer to these companies, they're also selling their company to you. But at the end of the day, this isn't called the science of the negotiation, right? It's the art of negotiation, because negotiation skill is more impactful than market data, right? You can have all of the data points in hand and then still not get an increase if you just don't do the negotiation correctly. So, just be mindful about what cards you're playing and when. Again, information is the currency here. You don't want to reveal everything at once. If you've got an upcoming promotion and you've got an exciting offer from TikTok and another exciting offer from DoorDash, maybe don't tell TikTok about your promotion yet. Maybe just focus on the DoorDash offer, see if that works. And if not, then try to use your promotion, right? Just be strategic in when you're revealing this info. So kind of diving into more of what negotiation skill means, part of it is just approaching the conversation from a collaborative perspective. Kind of going back to the, am I greedy question that I think a lot of people have, that fear, that also kind of, goes into the fear of confrontation, right? And, I'm right there with you. I don't like confrontation either. But if you approach this less of like, I'm going to have to go in and just say, I want 250K and they're going to have to do it, instead go in and make it about what makes your situation unique. Okay, so you've got an offer from DoorDash on the table. How you want to display that to your TikTok recruiter, right? And how do you make it you and the recruiter versus the problem, not you versus the recruiter? And to kind of go into that, I'll just skip this quickly. You want to think of your ask as more outlining your situation. So, one way of doing it that would be more confrontational is if you jump on the call and you say, hey, I'm looking for a yearly comp of 600K. If you don't provide any additional context, but if you go in collaboratively, think about, under the guise of full transparency, look, I just want to be really upfront with you guys. I've had some interviews with this other company. We discussed a yearly compensation of this amount. And I understand that you and this other company don't do compensation the same. But I just wanted to make you aware of this and see what could be doable given my situation, right? That feels a lot more of, you just reacting to the things that are happening and you making it very aware to your recruiter, as opposed to you coming in and saying, I need X amount or I'm walking, right? That's going to be a much more bombastic approach. Now, with the recruiter, I think an important thing to remember here is the recruiter actually doesn't really hold very much power in this situation. They're kind of more of a middle person between the compensation team, hiring manager, and the candidate, right? They sort of play this interesting position where they're, sort of an advocate for the company, but they're also sort of an advocate for you. So the best thing that I'd recommend in terms of improving your likelihood in the negotiation to get an increase is to really build a strong connection with your recruiter. I know they're basically a stranger. And you might also feel some resentment towards them or some frustration, especially recruiters can be flaky sometimes and they can sometimes use tough tones of voices on calls. But I would say, you got to remember that being a recruiter is not an easy job right now. They're sort of the TSA agents of the world, right? They're sort of like, having to get out a lot of bad news, and nobody's really that nice to these guys. So if you show them even a little bit of kindness, that's going to go a really long way, because they do want to try to find a happy medium. And, it might feel a little bit counterintuitive to want to do this negotiation with the recruiter if they don't really have as much control, because the hiring manager, they're the one who decides if you're getting the job, if your offer gets pulled, if anything like that. And, typically, if you want to try to go directly to the hiring manager, you can. It depends on the company size. If you're at a small company, you might be negotiating more directly with them. But, if you're at a bigger company, hiring managers, they do not love to negotiate. A lot of times they consider that below their pay grade. They consider it the recruiter's job, and they just don't want to get into numbers. But if you don't set up a call with your hiring manager before you get an offer, you are missing out. I would say you probably want to get 3 calls with the hiring manager scheduled. You want to have one where you're just, doing the interview, right? The interview questions. Then another one where you're kind of interviewing the hiring manager more, asking them, what's the scope of the role? What projects are you guys tackling? What problems are you trying to solve with these projects? What's worked, what's not? Get a real solid understanding of that scope of the role, and then ask them those tough questions about, what's the work-life balance, etc. Then the third conversation that you want to have with them is an impact roadmap conversation. Now, I know I've talked a lot about setting yourself up for success in terms of compensation. The impact roadmap sets yourself up for career success in the long term. Because essentially what this is this is an opportunity for you and the hiring manager to talk about your impact at the company 30 days in, 60 days in, 90 days in. So you separately, once you have this conversation about what the scope of the role is with the hiring manager, you would go and put together what your goals are for your time at the company, 30, 60, 90-day goals, what approaches you want to take to solve these problems that the managers are trying to solve. And when you go and you present this to the hiring manager, it really just shows them that you want to hit the ground running. You don't want to start and be, having onboarding syndrome where you're not really doing anything. You want to start and you want to start, right? And from the hiring manager's perspective, that shows that you are a strong value add. Gives them even more justification for why you should get an increase in your offer. And it also just helps you outline in the future, what projects you want to take on, and it just helps set your career up for success. Now, once you've done all of that and you're actually in the meat of the negotiations, you're doing the collaborative asks, another impactful thing that you can really do is lean into silence in these conversations. Because again, I've said it before, I'll continue to say it, information is the currency of the negotiation. If you are talking, you are revealing information. If you are not talking, you are not revealing info, right? It gives you more time to think through what you want to say next. And what I tell clients every single day is I'd much rather there be an awkward silence while you're trying to think through what you want to say or look to the script for the appropriate phrase than you rushing to say something you don't want to say, right? Because in that moment of fear, we sometimes can blurt things out. So just don't be afraid to sit in silence and really think through what you want to say. And recruiters, they hate awkward silences. They're going to try to fill them as much as possible, which gives you more of a chance to hear what information they're sharing. And basically, if the recruiter's doing the dominating of the talking, that's a pretty good sign, because whoever speaks the least in the negotiations typically tends to win. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about what do I do if I only have one opportunity on the table, 2 opportunities on the table. And I said I'd come back to it when we talk about portraying your leverage. Well, here we are. So I think the best way that you can portray your leverage creatively in a situation where maybe you don't have as many offers as you want, it's about framing conversations and your situation in a more flattering light. So think about, if you've got an offer in hand from TikTok, but you've applied to a position at DoorDash. Now, the way that you could frame this to your recruiter, if you think about your leverage as this 3D cube, you could frame it in this way of, oh, well, I've just applied to DoorDash, but I'm not really interviewing anywhere else. Or you could portray it as, yeah, so I'm in consideration for a position at DoorDash. I love that phrase. I'm in consideration. What does that even mean? It's it could mean anything. It could mean that you have an offer in hand. It could mean that you've applied, and that sort of creative portrayal, that flexible verbiage, that will just come across more strong to your recruiter, right? Now, again, I'm in consideration. That's a crumb of info. That's really nothing. But that can open the door for the recruiter to interpret it in any possible way. So if you give that recruiter just a vague sort of piece of information, that can really just help the recruiter kind of create this narrative without you having to be disingenuous, right? And I know in that negotiation skill section, I was talking a lot about as if this was a phone call conversation or in-person conversation. I would typically say for the most part, these conversations happen over phone calls, not in person. Even with places opening up in person, it's just mostly done over phone calls. But in some situations, it's done over email. So I kind of wanted to walk you through the pros and cons of both. So for phone calls, the benefit of a phone call is that it has the highest probability of success if you make this ask over the phone. You can really control the tone of voice that you're conveying, especially if you've practiced a few times. And, this isn't something that can drop to the bottom of the recruiter's inbox. This is not something they can ignore, right? They have to listen. They have to address what you're saying. While, phone calls, they're also really stressful. I think my generation and younger, they don't want to jump on the phone, right? And I don't blame you. I hate phone calls as well. But ultimately, it can bring performance anxiety, and these recruiters, again, like I said earlier, they're flaky, right? That can be challenging to actually pin them down on the call. But with emails, you don't really have to worry about that. You're not worrying about saying the wrong thing. You don't have to worry about blurting anything out. You don't have to deal with scheduling the recruiter to get on a call within their busy day. And it is the fastest option. It doesn't really require as much preparation. But the downside is it's pretty easy for an email to slip to the bottom of the recruiter's inbox and for them to not respond to it. And you also don't want the recruiter to misinterpret your tone of voice. You would think in the year 2022, we would have some way of more easily conveying our tone of voice over text. But unfortunately, we don't. And, if you're typing things like, asks that might sound, collaborative over a phone call, things like, well, I'm, really excited about DoorDash, but what I'm struggling with is how could I accept this offer given the gap with Apple? But the recruiter might read it as, well, yeah, I'm excited about DoorDash, but how could I accept this offer given the gap with Apple, right? You don't want them to misinterpret and take it the wrong way, right? And ultimately, I've seen clients who are super scared of jumping on calls. We do an email ask. 5 minutes later, the phone rings. Recruiter. So I would just say, you might have to jump on a call anyway. So at the end of the day, if it's your first counter offer, do it over a phone call. If you've already done your first counter offer, they've given you an updated offer, and maybe you want to push back one more time, then maybe do it over email because, they already know that you're negotiating in good faith. Now, how long will this negotiation take? This is something that I'm asked quite frequently. And ultimately, it's very personal, right? I can't make the decision to have you sign on the dotted line or not, right? That's all up to you. And I think a lot of times recruiters want you to make this decision like that. But I would say you cannot make this decision unless you know your three numbers. These three numbers are, what's your walkaway point? What's realistically the lowest number that you could financially accept and still be afloat, right? And then number two, what's your target number? What would be that number where maybe if you've got financial goals for the future of buying a house, getting married, having children, what target would you want to aim for where you can potentially reach those financial goals while also still, saving some money, right? And then aspirational, what's a number that you literally could not refuse? Is that $1 million? Is that $900,000? Is that $800,000? Go down that incrementally until you get to that aspirational number, right? And I think for a lot of people, they feel this desire to wrap up the negotiation quickly because they're tired. They've gone through these interviews. They likely have a full-time job already. They likely also have a family with children. This is a lot of time and bandwidth that this negotiation is taking up. But I will tell you this, generally, the longer a negotiation goes on, the more profitable it ends up being both in the career and in the cash for the candidate. And you have to find a balance, right? You can't make this negotiation go on for 3 months, right? You don't want to alienate the company, but you also can't make a life-changing decision in 24 hours. I'm sorry, but you can't, right? It's too much. So the more educated you are about what you realistically accept and what you cannot afford to accept, that's really going to help you bring clarity in these tough decision-making moments. And as frightening as it can sound, especially in this economy, sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away. really think through what's the best alternative to the negotiated amount. What would happen if you walked away? Would you be financially stable? Would you still have a home? Would you still have food on your table? Do you have another job that you could go back to in case things fall through? Do you have other options on the table? And at the end of the day, walking away could potentially lead you to a company that could value you higher. Again, like that client that I had that had the Stripe and Plaid opportunities. She could have just accepted the mediocre Stripe offer, but by walking away, she ended up getting more money from Plaid. Now, we've talked a bit about the tactics that you should use in the negotiation, but what tactics should you expect from these recruiters and managers? Now, I'll go through all of these in a little bit more detail, but essentially we're looking at, these tight timelines, which we've talked about earlier, haggling on the call of what your actual value is. They'll oversell the value of your offer. They'll use delightful phrases like best and final and other guilt-inducing verbiage. And with tight timelines, this is really how they get, especially lower level candidates, to get more mediocre offers, to accept more mediocre offers. Because ultimately you feel like, oh, my leverage is a little bit more limited and I'm tired and drained from the negotiation, from the interviews. I just want to finish it up. They give you a deadline of a week or less. You in that situation do start to feel the fear of losing the opportunity if the timeline comes, right? So from your perspective, you want to just accept the offer and wrap it up, right? And one thing important to remember is the hiring manager sets the timeline. So the only real justification they can have is if they have another candidate waiting in the wings. And they typically tell you pretty front if there is one. Oftentimes I'll hear recruiters say, well, we do have another candidate that we're waiting on that, I don't want to make them wait forever. But in many cases, we can push for timeline extensions. In fact, I have a client right now who was kind of told this same rhetoric by this company. Oh, we have another candidate waiting in the wings, but they've been super accommodating and extending the timeline now that they know that she's more inclined to accept, right? They're kind of bending over backwards to accommodate her. And part of it is just reinforcing, hey, I am excited about this opportunity, but I just feel I owe it to myself to make an educated decision. So can I have a little bit more time, please? And, in terms of the haggling, this is something that, can be kind of frustrating. You might ask for that amount of like $200K yearly comp, and your recruiter might say, oh, well, $200K, that's never going to happen. We could do 160 though. It would be a lot of work and an uphill battle, but if I got that approved, would you be ready to sign? Now, be careful here, because if you're like, oh, sure, 160 works, that's the number they're going to go back to the team with. They're not going to go back and say, well, they asked for 200, but I told them 160. They're just going to say they asked for 160. Right? So hold firm on that 200K, really appreciate you advocating for me on this. It would still be a tough decision considering the gap in comp. If you could ask the team if 200K is possible, I greatly appreciate it and would be ready to sign. Now, again, when we were talking about startups, this is something that we expect. They're going to oversell the offer value, especially if you're at a startup. They're going to tell you that this is worth millions of dollars, that there's so much potential here, that you're on the next unicorn. Right? And then at public companies, oftentimes they'll tell you, oh, well, when you've got equity refreshers factored in, you're actually pretty close to this amount, especially once you get promoted, blah, blah, blah. It's great to talk about future earnings, and you're excited about that. But you got to look at the numbers on the page today, right? Because ultimately, your leverage opportunity probably also has refreshers or annual bonuses or some kind of long-term incentive or potential for stock growth. Right? So we need to look at it apples to apples. We can't, factor in refreshers for your opportunity, but not for this other one, right? Best and final. If I had a nickel for every time I heard the word, this is the best and final offer, I would be a millionaire. This is just a straight up lie. Oftentimes we see recruiters say this all the time, and it's not true. It is not the best and final offer. In my own personal experience negotiating, I was coming to this company, and they told me, oh, this is not going to be negotiable. And I said, oh, okay, well, I did just want to let you guys know that I did get, an opportunity at this other competing company, and they are willing to consider me for this. Oh, okay, well, we'll see what we can do. We'll see what we can do on the comp. So it wasn't best and final after all, right? So don't let best and final scare you. Don't let it hold you back. Otherwise, if we did, we wouldn't negotiate past the first offer. Guilt-inducing verbiage, this is kind of along that same vein. Oh, it sounds like you're really excited about Meta and we're trying to change the world here. I guess if you really are caring about money, then go to Meta, you know? It sounds like comp's super important to you. And since we'll never be able to match, should just end the process. Oh, you have to come in with the right level of expectations, with the right level of comp, because we want to set you up for success. And we'll take care of you once you've come in and prove yourself. All of this is so guilt inducing, right? And the best way to mitigate the guilt inducing, verbiage is to kind of respond back with an excitement sandwich. Because typically when they're using this verbiage, it's because they're scared that you're not interested in the opportunity. So by the excitement sandwich, I mean, there's sort of a concept in leadership called the compliment sandwich. When you want to give someone a piece of negative feedback, you give them a compliment, negative feedback, compliment. Now the excitement sandwich is kind of the same general principle, but it's you express your excitement for the opportunity, so excited about the possibility of joining TikTok. And then you express your reservation. But the thing that I'm struggling with is, how could I accept this offer given the gap with Airtable? And then your other piece of excitement, look, if you were able to go back to the team and close the gap further, I'd be ready to sign today, right? So that just shows the recruiter that you still are motivated and interested by the opportunity. It's just this one thing that's holding you back from signing the offer letter today. Now, this question is one I get often, and this is a very real and valid fear. Is there a chance that my offer could be rescinded? Yes, there is a chance. It is possible, but it is very improbable. The probability is less than 2% of the time. And in my personal experience, I have never, in my 2 years of negotiating, had a client lose an offer. Yes, that includes even in today's economy. And a lot of times, this is the fear that has a chokehold on candidates, making them not want to negotiate in the first place. And it's so, so unlikely, because you have to remember these companies are investing time and money to get you to this point. They don't want to spend 6 months interviewing you, 3 weeks negotiating for them to just end up pulling the offer. That's not financially lucrative for them. That's a huge waste of time and money, right? And, if you're still very, very concerned about it, the best way that you can get an offer rescinded is if you go in there and you ask for something incredibly high with no justification and you say something offensive. That's when the offer is going to get pulled. Because you also have to recognize too, the hiring manager is the one who decides if the offer gets pulled. So if you ask for, a 20% increase and you share that with your recruiter, and then your recruiter goes back, makes an appeal to the hiring manager that, hey, they tried to negotiate, they should pull the offer. That doesn't really make sense, right? It doesn't seem very probable. But, if you're really concerned about it, understand your leverage, right? Are there other candidates that are in the pipeline? Do you know how you compare to them? Do you know what the head count is for this position? And how much buy-in, social capital do you really have from the team and the manager and the senior leaders? When you did the impact roadmap, was it received positively or neutrally? That sort of thing will kind of help give you that context too. In the very, very rare instance that this occurs, and I'll just say this too, your hiring manager would reach out to you directly with an email saying, hey, we're going to pull the offer. It's not going to be subtle, right? It's very revivable. It really kind of comes down to understanding how much your hiring manager is motivated to work with you. But, we can pretty easily get that offer back on the table. But I'd really encourage you in that situation to ask yourself, if you did that counteroffer in a respectful way, you asked for an increase that wasn't too high, you had strong leverage, your conversation was positive, and your manager still pulls the offer, do you even really want to work there? It doesn't sound like a very good work environment. Now, I know I've been going on and on for almost an hour now, so I will try to wrap it up with my top 5 takeaways that, if you can retain anything from this webinar today, this is what I'd like you to walk away with. Number 1, get yourself to take the shot. In the words of Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you never take, right? And as long as you ask respectfully and for a reasonable amount, the worst they can do is say no, or potentially reveal themselves to be a non-desirable workplace, right? Other takeaway is to set yourself up for success, not just in terms of the compensation aspect, but also in the career aspect. Do research, try to understand, is this the best company for you long-term? Try to set up multiple, interviews with similarly focused companies at similar sizes. Try to get the timelines aligned as much as you can so you can create a bidding war. And, have these conversations with your hiring manager. How much do they really like you? Do they have other candidates waiting in the wings? And this is kind of where that impact roadmap comes in again. You're outlining your goals without strings attached. You're not going in and saying, here's my 30, 60, 90-day goals, and that's why I need 600K, right? You're just outlining your goals and trying to make sure that you're on the same page with your hiring manager. You can even be off base. You can even suggest implementation of a potential solution, and your manager might say, yeah, we did try it, but I like where your head's at. It ultimately shows proactively your motivation and the high value add that you bring to the team. And if you, again, want to test how the relationship with the manager is, if you do the impact roadmap and they walk away feeling super pumped and really excited, that's a great sign. If they walk away pretty neutral, that might not be as good of a sign. And again, framing your leverage appropriately. Think about the information and how it's coming across. The less info you reveal, the better. It's always acceptable, especially if you're interviewing somewhere else, but you haven't gotten an offer yet from them. Let's say you've gotten an offer from TikTok and you've been interviewing at DoorDash. It is always fair to expect compensation. You can say, I'm expecting 500K from DoorDash, right? It's very fair because, again, you're doing your research. You have a solid understanding of what these companies pay. And ultimately, you give them that little crumb of info. Oh, I'm in consideration. Let the recruiter ask the clarifying questions before volunteering more information on that. And who's the biggest enemy in this negotiation? It's ourselves. It's that inner critic within us, right? That anxiety voice telling us we're not worth it, telling us that we can't do it, telling us that we're going to lose. Don't let yourself talk yourself out of negotiating. In some instances, I've seen clients leave hundreds and thousands of dollars on the table because they were scared of getting the offer pulled. And, people have accepted an offer after 1K yearly comp just because there was a timeline pressure. And that's something that we can mitigate so easily. And there could have been so much more potential for upside. Remember that DeepMind researcher story. She was down by $660,000 in the 4-year value of her offer compared to her colleagues, right? Don't put yourself in that situation. Set yourself up for success. All right. Is my presentation. This right here is a QR code to book me, but I can also include a link to my LinkedIn page in the chat. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and start looking at the questions. Awesome. Yep, 100% correct. And 24 hours is not enough time to make a life-changing decision. Yeah, phone calls are scary for sure. Oh, I apologize. If anybody's hearing an echo, that's not ideal. Interesting companies like TikTok and Airtable offer that choice. Yeah, it's not even a choice, to be honest. It's just kind of what they offer. They won't even offer you the stock options anymore, and that's mostly because they don't want folks to get that upside. Especially, a lot of the people who do have that, I actually was learning about this today. A lot of the people that do have the stock options are based in China, but they don't want to give any of those stock options to folks in the US. So employees in China at TikTok, they can buy back their options, but employees in the US cannot do that. Let's see. As business owners, negotiations are incredibly important. I made the mistake of accepting my first offer when my first job out of college, and I definitely will not be doing that again. Thank you so much for sharing your story. That is absolutely huge. Business owners, they need to know how to negotiate, right? And you'll be surprised at how much stuff in your day-to-day life is actually negotiable. Did you know Airbnbs are negotiable? You can negotiate the price down on an Airbnb. It's true. Just email the owner. And then somebody says, I've heard that when you negotiate, you should negotiate in dollars per month versus dollars per year. Would love to hear your thoughts. That's a really good question, Calencia. I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. I would say dollars per year, it kind of depends upon the company that you're looking at. If they're offering you compensation in the form of yearly comp, I'd say do a counter that's in that same compensation structure. Especially if they're offering you like an equity-based salary, annual bonus. I would recommend trying to call out your counter offer in that same structure. But if they are offering you monthly pay, I think that you could definitely, do a counter with that monthly pay amount. But just try to keep it consistent with what the pay was that they, originally said to you, whether it's hourly, salary, etc. All right. Yeah. And then, yeah, I did just want to make sure that we have all the questions addressed here. Um, if you were given a salary range during the pre-screen, can you negotiate again at the offer stage if it's lower than you want? That's a really good question. So, before you do the screen, before you do the interviews, if they quote you a rough range, or if it's on the job application, that's definitely not the full range. I would say whenever a recruiter quotes you a range and you see a range on a job posting, expect that range to be like the bottom to the half of what the comp range actually is, because they're never going to tell you what the top of the band is, right? So I would say in that scenario, don't be afraid to ask above it. I've had clients who push back when there's a salary range that's given on the job application. We go and we do a counter offer later on. Never have I had a recruiter say, well, that's outside the range that's on the posting. They don't say that, right? They know that range is kind of nonsense, right? And I would also say, too, if you're pressured to give a number pre-screen, if on the job application you are pressured to write a number and you write like 200K, totally fine for you to come back in the offer stage and say, hey, about that 200K, I didn't really have a good sense of my market value then. And, I apologize because I know you guys worked hard to get above 200K. But, after I've learned more about my market value, it looks like it's more closer to 300. If there was anything that you could do on this, I'd greatly appreciate it. Yeah. What do they say? How do you respond to recruiters who ask you what you're currently making when you're trying to negotiate? Great question. Great question. In this case, it's illegal in most states for them to ask you what your current compensation is. Double check your state, but in the state of Washington, California, New York, super illegal for them to ask you that. And if they do ask you, hey, what are you currently making? That's a bit personal. I'm just not comfortable sharing that right now. And that's a pretty safe way to mitigate that. Also, just some more helpful verbiage if they're asking you what your compensation expectations are. It can be hard to respond and, just keep saying, no, I don't really want to right now, because then the kind of dialogue becomes from the recruiter, oh, can you please? No, I don't really want to. Oh, can you please? No, I don't really want to. But I'd say if you frame it more around ignorance of like, look, I just don't know what my market worth is. If you could give me a rough range or a first offer, that would really help me, right? So it's putting the ask back on the recruiter. It's not just you sitting there and saying, no, I don't feel comfortable. It's putting the ask back on them. So then that way they're encouraged to share more info. What if the salary is posted with the job description? Yeah. So again, if the salary is posted on the job description, typically it's just the range is from the bottom of the band to the middle of the band. So again, don't really use that too heavily. Also, it's not really clear on most job postings if it's the base salary range or the yearly compensation range, or does it factor in the equity grant? Does it factor in the annual bonus? So with that, I would say don't really worry too much about having to abide within that salary range that's posted on the job description. Also, a lot of times it's not catered to your individual location. If you're going to be working out of California, the job posting might, be, oh, this has options for California, Bay Area, also New York, also Seattle. So if you're in Seattle, that range is probably going to be different anyway. Okay, somebody asked, what do you recommend when the recruiter or hiring manager is trying to negotiate at the first interview and screening call, and the hiring manager at the first interview says that this toll is capped at X amount, which is below my range? Great question. And I kind of want to tack onto this the leveling question that I saw earlier, because I'd recommend pushing for an up level, I'd really say. Because in that circumstance, it just sounds like it's a level that's below what your experience is and what your market value is. And a lot of times in these companies, what you can do is, sit down with the manager and talk about what your current experience is, and if you have any other opportunities at a higher level, and use that as your primary leverage to kind of justify why you need an up level. But oftentimes negotiating an up level, it's the best thing to do is go directly to the manager. Don't try to negotiate it with the recruiter, because the manager is the one who sets your level to begin with. And they also have the context on, is there even headcount for the level above, right? So, it is more challenging. I think up levels, it's about 1 in 4 actually go through in terms of, yes, you do end up being at the higher level. But at the same time, pushing for it can give you more justification for why you need a higher amount. So, And the example that Ogana, I apologize again if I said your name incorrectly, the example that they call out here of, what do you recommend if the hiring manager says it's capped, you can definitely still ask and see if they're willing to go up. That could just be a way that they try to vet folks early. But then you could also ask for an up level. And if that's not working, again, maybe it's just not the best environment. And I saw someone said, does an unlimited PTO limit negotiations on a higher salary? Meaning, am I forfeiting one or the other? Interesting. Not typically. PTO is something that is not as negotiable as we want it to be. Especially at big tech companies, it's pretty standardized. Amazon's only going to offer you 3 weeks PTO. They're never going to increase that, regardless if you have unlimited PTO right now. Also, unlimited PTO at a lot of companies is actually kind of a scam, mostly because it's like, oh, we offer unlimited PTO, but if you take more than 2 weeks, we're going to be mad at you, right? But the internal company culture doesn't really support you taking unlimited time off. And I would say, if you're forfeiting, I don't really think that you'd be forfeiting compensation if you have unlimited PTO on offer. But I would say that you have to pick your battles, right? If you try really, really hard to push for unlimited PTO, they might be less willing to move on compensation, and vice versa. So just think about what is the most important thing for you in this case, and try to highlight that. Now, I wanted to make sure I was getting through all the questions. Oh, thank you for highlighting this one. Could you speak a bit more about negotiating reduced time or increase in PTO? It is quite challenging. I think ultimately, it kind of comes down to using your leverage opportunities. And I think if it's a smaller company, it's maybe more doable. But you can definitely ask. I would always guide you to ask. And the worst, again, thing that they can say is no. But especially if it's a young startup, a lot of times those policies are still pretty flexible. So you can ask. But again, think about what's a reasonable ask. If they've offered you 3 weeks, maybe jumping to unlimited isn't really going to happen, but maybe you could ask for an additional 4 days. You could also see how you can accrue PTO. Is there a way to expedite that? Especially if you have like vacations and stuff planned already. I always guide folks to let recruiters know about that sooner rather than later, just in case the start date like conflicts with the vacation or something like that. So that way you're just being fully transparent. Please flag to me. How do you go about negotiating what level you come in is? Yeah, that's the one that we talked about a little bit earlier. Up level, definitely challenging. Definitely not an easy one to go about. But I think, again, focus on, do your research. Are you at a big public company? If so, best resource for you to look at, Levels.fyi. They have the leveling structure fully outlined on there for most big tech companies. Now, if your job title is not software engineer, I'd say still look at the software engineer leveling, because it's probably going to be pretty similar to what the leveling looks like for your role, unless it's management, in which case look at software engineering manager job title. Oftentimes they'll have those levels outlined. But the benefit is like if you're looking at Facebook and Apple and you want to decide, okay, what level makes sense for me to use as leverage with Facebook to get an increase in my level, you can see, okay, here's what Apple's leveling structure looks like, here's what Facebook's is, here's how I'm comparing, right? And then use that to your advantage of, oh, Apple's considering me at ICT 4. With that in mind, would it be possible to be, up leveled at Meta to L6? And another thing that you can do to help push for an up level, offer to re-interview. Because more often than not, especially if you're a technical person, if you focus on like, what were the misses that you felt were in my interviews? A lot of times it'll be like, oh, the systems design interview didn't go very well. You could even say in some situations like, what can I do to prove that I can perform at this level? Would another interview help? I'd be happy to redo my systems design interview. And in a lot of instances, they can be willing for you to do that. And here's the thing, a lot of people get worried, like, what if I re-interview and I do badly? They're not going to pull the offer if you re-interview and you do equivalent, right, as to how you did before, because that offer is still out there, right? And again, it's not going to lower your percent for increase. It actually increases the likelihood of you getting an increase in the offer, just because you're demonstrating like, look, I feel that I'm at this higher level. Because of that, I also feel that the compensation should be at a higher dollars per month versus dollars per year. I think we already went through that one. Just want to make sure everybody's questions are being addressed. I think somebody asked about the webinar recording. So that can be sent out, I believe, after. Just want to make sure. It doesn't look like there are many other questions, but what I wanted to do now, I want to send you guys a link to my LinkedIn profile. Please feel free to connect with me on there. And you can message me, and I'm with you guys to do a free consultation call about any, upcoming negotiation that you may have. Ultimately, I think at the end of the day, sometimes that free consultation call can really just help you solidify, where am I going in this situation? And it doesn't always mean that you need to engage with the service, but at the very least, having that sort of second opinion come in, kind of reassure you or give you guidance, I think that can really help. So don't hesitate, even if your location or your job title might not be 100%, a software engineer at a big tech company. I probably helped before, just for context, in terms of locations, I've helped people negotiate offers out of Singapore, out of Germany, out of Russia, out of all these locations. So definitely something that I'm comfortable with. And I apologize, my Wi-Fi is quite slow right now, but I am sending you a profile link to LinkedIn. How do I type in the chat? Maybe I'll send it in the private chat, and maybe. And Nate, do you think you could post that in the regular chat? I'm not sure how I can do that here. But if you could do that, I'd greatly appreciate it. Or maybe have it highlight on the screen or something. Yeah, thank you guys so much for attending. I really, really appreciate it. Oh, thank you so much, very much, Tribaja. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd love to chat. Yeah, Abby, thank you guys for your time. I want to encourage you to, for you folks, especially folks who, are Black, Indigenous, women, other people of color, please negotiate. You deserve to negotiate, okay? You deserve to push for more money. Let's take these money from these billionaires and put it back in your pocket, okay? And whether you do that by yourself or whether you do that with my help, I'm going to support you 100% of the way, okay? But with all that being said, that's the webinar. Oh, great question. Great question, Ogana. Negotiating severance at the offer stage. Yes. Negotiate severance. Do it 100%. I did it when I joined my startup, and it was scary, but it was also necessary, right? And I think with the economy being where it's at, the ask can be relatively straightforward of just like, look, I'm really excited about the growth potential that this company has, but I have to be realistic with myself about the economy, and I want to make sure that I'm going to stay afloat if something were to happen. With that in mind, would you be willing to offer a severance package in that case? And, what could I expect? Now, if it's a company like Stripe or Amazon, they probably have that sort of thing pre-outlined. But I think definitely if you're at a smaller company or if you're at a startup, set that in stone early. Just because you never know what's going to happen. And it's always better to do it at the offer stage than when you're on your way out. When you're on your way out, it's a lot harder to negotiate severance. We've seen folks, they get laid off. They get sent like a severance package via a mass email of like, HR@twitter.com or something like that. And when they try to respond to that email and negotiate, they're basically just, responding to sort of like a massive inbox that nobody's really reading through, right? So I would say if you can do it before you sign the offer letter, that's really ideal. I'd say, you have to know when to make the ask. And I think you would probably want to do it once compensation has been resolved. But, ultimately, I think it comes down to what you're prioritizing. And in terms of length of time for severance, I'd say typically it's like 12 to 14 weeks is what we're seeing. Somebody asked a great question. Do you recommend negotiating a severance package from a large, well-known company? Definitely try. 100%. I think it's worth it. Because a lot of times, we're seeing folks get, some severance packages that are like 12 to 14 weeks of paid time. And some folks are getting expedited equity vesting. And other folks are getting like 6 weeks with no expedited equity vesting. And especially for these big tech companies, that equity is where the majority of the value sits, right? So I definitely ask about that. But again, if it's before you sign the offer, a lot easier than after. If you've already been laid off at a company, if you have a point of contact there that you can still reach out to, that's, maybe higher up, like your old boss or something like that, especially if you were laid off and not terminated for cause, then I think it's very probable that you could reach out to that manager and say, hey, really appreciated my time with you, and I know the economy is where it is. I just want to keep myself and my family afloat. With that in mind, do you think it'd be possible to expedite my equity vesting, that sort of thing? But again, don't bother reaching back out to ask at Stripe or whatever. Reach out to an actual person at the company. Great questions, guys. This is awesome. Oh, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I said thank you so much. This is really informative and helpful. We appreciate you for being a part of this. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It truly was an honor, and great job hosting the event.
Thank you. So, everyone, you can connect with her on LinkedIn. Her LinkedIn profile link is in the chat. So she's offering free salary negotiation consultation. So you can take advantage of that, when reaching out to her. Yeah. Thank you for being a part of this.
Definitely.
Yeah. Any last words, Annie?
Please negotiate. Please. I think it's worth it. And you definitely can do it. Don't let that inner voice tell you you can't.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you,
wonderful
guys.
day. Yeah.
You too.
Bye.